Hello and welcome to ASMR Chess. Today I'm going to show you a game. Not a particularly brilliant one, not even a particularly beautiful one, but it's one that I played, and it's one that I am actually rather proud of. Not because I beat somebody who was way better than me, because I didn't. I played against someone on a similar skill level. No, I'm proud of this game because I think it is my most accurate game of chess that I have ever played. So journey with me into this black and white jungle of calm chess goodness. I had the white pieces. You will be taking my perspective and journey with me as I open the game with the queen's pawn to d4. My opponent answered in kind with pawn to d5. And if you know anything about me, then I think you can guess what I played now. The explosive one. Pawn to c4. The queen's gambit. My opponent did not accept the gambit, but instead played the queen's gambit declined. I put up my knight. Knights before bishops, unless you have another reason. If you have a reason to do something else, then it's fine, but it must be a good reason. My opponent also developed a knight, and I developed a knight. Here, my opponent thought he had a good reason to do something with his bishop, this guy. So he went all the way over here, pinning the knight to the king. And I said, well, two can play at that game. And I played my bishop out, pinning his knight to his queen. And here, my opponent made a mistake that cost him the game. Not because I had checkmate in 2 moves, or he hung a piece, or anything like that. No, he tried to capture this pawn and hold on to it. And if you have seen my video on my opening tricks, you will know that it's not a good idea to try and hold on to this pawn. So first, he captured my knight with a check to his majesty. Nothing much to think about here. I recapture with the pawn. And here it is that he thought he could just go ahead and grab my brave little soldier, the c4 pawn. Cheers. That is some damn good tea. So I want to recapture this guy. And if you know a little bit about the Queen's Gambit setup, you know we can try and get him back with this bishop right here. And usually I will play pawn only here in order to get this guy. But in this game I played the pawn all the way to this little juicy e4 square. Because if you remember in the other video, we needed this diagonal from here to the rook to be open in order to punish black for trying to keep this guy. This strategy is a little different. Here I am threatening to advance this pawn to e5. This will attack the pinned piece, and this knight won't be able to move, because if it does, I will capture the queen. So you can imagine my surprise when my opponent played b5 anyways, saying I am not going to allow you to capture this pawn. My move seems obvious. I play the pawn on and attack the pinned piece as I had planned. Also opening up this potentially very interesting diagonal. But my opponent had something planned here. He attacked the bishop. So now that if I take, he can recapture the bishop. So that if I capture the knight, he can recapture the bishop. I would then capture this guy. He would slide his rook over, possibly with his pinky, and get the pawn back. The position would be a little weird. He would have no good way to castle his king or get his king to safety, but he would be up a pawn. So I came up with a plan of my own. I maintained the pin, and I had a little idea for when he broke the pin again. A little devilish idea. Can you spot the idea? I'll give you a second. I captured this guy. Not with the bishop, but with the knight. So now he has some problems. Because if he captured the knight, like so, I can recapture the pawn, and the pin is still there, and that's not going anywhere. So even though I temporarily sacrifice the knight, I will get the knight back. This guy can't move. I will capture the queen if he does. And I will have backed these two pawns. So I will be up a lot with an ongoing attack. So my opponent correctly identified that the main problem in his position was the relationship between this bishop and this queen. So he moved the queen out of the way instead of capturing the pawn, instead of capturing the knight. So now I'm thinking, okay, he didn't want to capture my knight that I sacrificed, but this is a brave knight. It wants to be sacrificed for the cause of winning this game. So I picked up the knight and I captured down here. Now my opponent is left with a choice. Should he recapture immediately or try to do something first? He tried to do something first and gave a check on e4 with the queen. I blocked the check with my bishop, not with my queen. I do not want to exchange queens unless I have a good reason when I have an attacking position. And now my opponent can choose if he wants to capture the bishop or the knight. The knight is attacking this rook, and it can even come out again. So capturing the bishop is not the best decision. My opponent captured the knight. And now, finally, I can capture that knight. I can capture that knight with my bishop. Putting this bishop on this extremely strong square at the forefront of the pawn chain. The rook is attacked. He used his pinky to slide the rook over, giving me an opportunity to mess this game up. Because here, maybe you would like to finish your development and castle, but that would hang checkmate in one with the queen takes g2. So I did not play that. Instead, I put my queen on d2. This does two things. It opens up an attack here on h6 and clears the way to castle kingside. And I would like to castle kingside to free this bishop up. It's currently pinned to the king and can't move, but as soon as I castle, it can move. So I'm moving with the tempo. My opponent had to defend the pawn from the queen. And now I could castle. And even though this could look as a defensive move, it now opens up this bishop to come here to h5 and pin this rook to the king. My opponent cannot allow this, so he retreated a little bit with his queen in order to cover this square. I said, okay, I will attack the queen because I want her gone. Now the queen went back to e4, because this pawn now blocks the bishop. I continued pawn on, reigniting the threat for the bishop to come here, and my opponent moved his queen to h4, protecting again. And maybe it looks like white is running a little bit out of gas because black is able to defend against all these threats. But it's never a good sign if you have to move your queen around the board while your opponent can develop his entire army or her entire army. You see these three pieces back here? The bishop, the knight, and the rook. They are on their starting squares, not participating in the attack. pawn. My opponent recaptured with the queen. Now I exchange the queens because I have a very, very, very good reason. And my reason is that I want to put a rook on this open file and go for a checkmating attack against the king. And I said this is my most accurate chess game, but it is not perfect. It was a case of the wrong rook. If you have ever read Bobby Fischer's 60 Memorable Games, you will know what I'm talking about. I used this rook and put it on the G file. So come down here, check the king, and start my checkmating attack. And I should have used the other rook. My opponent defended the check. And now I got to thinking. I really would like this bishop to be on this square so that it could attack the rook, chase it away from the defense, so I could come down, give my check, double up with the other rook, and deliver checkmate. But the bishop can't really just move 2 squares ahead. So what do we do? Well, if you remember, in the Queen's Gambit, when your opponent tries to hold on to the c4 pawn with this structure here, the diagonal towards the rook is exposed, and you can use that to your advantage. So I played bishop to f3, attacking the rook. The rook can be defended with pawn to c6. It's protected by the knight, so I cannot come down and capture, and I cannot get the rook. But what I can do is move the bishop up here. And I did a little magic trick there. I moved the bishop 2 squares ahead in a way that it normally can't move, because I moved with tempo. Now the rook is attacked. It has to move, and it captures the pawn. Notice that that would not have been possible had I used the other rook, because then this rook would have protected this square. Still, I have a tremendous attack, and I play the check. My opponent retreats, and I double up the rooks. Now, if I were to come down with this rook, it would be defended by the other rook. So he had to defend again, went all the way back, and defended the critical square. And here I have quite a nice little checkmating idea. Maybe you can find it. It starts with this bishop giving this check. When you calculate positions on a chessboard, you want to first find all the moves that gives check, because those are the most forcing. You always want to be looking for the most forcing moves, because that way you can find the critical ideas faster. So first you look for checks, then you look for captures, and then you look for threats. You don't play the most forcing move all the time, but you want to know what it is, both for you and for your opponent. My opponent had only one legal move. It was to go here with the king. I threw another check with these bishops, with this bishop. My opponent have single square allowed again, so he went here with the king. And now I have checkmate in one move. And actually I have a couple. I have 3 different checkmates in one. They all work in exactly the same way. I played the discovered checkmate, bishop to h4. I put it here because it could in principle be captured by the rook had the king not been in check from my rook. When I keep the bishop on this diagonal, the king's escape square down here doesn't work because it's still under attack. King is also in check by the rook, taking away this square. Bishop, white light squared bishop takes away this square, and the pawn takes away this square. So that is checkmate on the board. That's my game. I hope you enjoyed it. Now that you've seen the game, I will go over it once more, a little faster this time, because then you should be able to recognize the ideas now that you know what to look for. Let's reset the board. We saw d4, d5, c4. The Queen's Gambit declined. Standard development. Out with the second knight and the pin. I also pinned. And my opponent tried to cash in. Check. Recaptures. And then he took the pawn. I played e4, opening up the bishop, attacking this pawn, and also threatening to go e5 and attack the pinned piece. My opponent made his mistake that cost him the game and tried to hold on to this pawn. I advanced with e5. My opponent attacked the bishop. I retreated the bishop. He broke the pin. And I sacrificed the knight. My opponent moved his queen to d5, getting out of the pin. insisted on sacrificing the knight and captured on f7, allowing my opponent to play queen e4 check, which I blocked with bishop to e2, and my opponent then captured the knight. I also captured his knight with my bishop, attacking the rook over here. The rook got out of the attack and also became active looking at g2. I moved my queen to d2 with plans of castling to open up this bishop, and also with plans of capturing on h6 with my queen. My opponent defended h6 with the rook. I castled long, which by the way is allowed. You'll know that the rules for castling prohibits castling over an attacked square. But b1 is attacked, correct, but the king does not pass over it. The rook is allowed, only the king is not. After castles, the bishop is now free to go to h5, so my opponent defends h5. I attack the queen, the pawn is protected by the bishop, queen gets out of the way, and I advance the pawn. My opponent plays the queen to h4, protecting h5, and I capture here, exchanging the queens. So that I could slide my rook over to come down here with a check and a deadly attack. My opponent moved his rook again, and you'll notice that he's played one knight move and then two bishop moves, coming here and then capturing here, some pawn moves, and then the vast majority of his moves has been with the rook and with the queen. I use this little device to gain a tempo on the rook. He blocked with the pawn. I came in with the bishop, and now my opponent captured down here, allowing me to throw the check. He got out of the check, and I doubled the rooks. He defended against my rook coming to g8, but I have checkmate in a couple moves now. Check with the bishop. King goes to the only legal square. Check with the other bishop. King again goes to the only legal square. And now checkmate. Like so. So that's the video. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you had a good time. I hope you relaxed. I hope I will see you in the next video. If you like my work, please like, subscribe, maybe throw a comment in there.